And the next item is from Spiked Online here on Radio Free UK, the 64th weekly Friday show. It's entitled Last Orders. Our weight is none of the state's business.
Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, and in this monthly show, myself and Chris Snowden from the Institute of Economic Affairs take a look back on the month in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. In this episode, we're joined by Spiked columnist and campaigns manager at Action on Consumer Choice, Rob Lyons, to discuss the government obesity strategy, whether Theresa May will be good or bad for lifestyle freedom, and the snobbery of the war on booze. This month, Theresa May's government launched its strategy for tackling the alleged crisis of obesity, and it sparked uproar among public health experts. Despite maintaining George Osborne's sugar tax, it was criticised for not taking more action on junk food advertising and relying on voluntary action from food companies. So in general, it's gone down as a bit of a sop to the food industry and the first major mistake of May's government. So Chris, just to kick things off, could you tell us a bit more about this story? Is this just more proof that public health busybodies are never happy, no matter how much you give them? Or was this a significant U-turn, do you think?
A little bit of both, to be honest. I mean, the busybodies got everything they could have hoped for. They would never have imagined in their wildest dreams 12 months ago that they would actually have a sugar tax. They wouldn't have imagined, I don't think, that the government would seriously be considering putting little pictures of teaspoons to illustrate how much sugar there is in a product. And they've got the main thing that they started out for, which is a reformulation of products to reduce sugar by 20%, which I'm dead against because it's going to make food taste less nice. Simple as that. But they've got it. 20% is, I know they were asking for 50%, but that was completely barking mad. They got 20%, which is everything I think deep down they were hoping for. And yeah, of course it's a voluntary agreement. It's insane that they think that you can legislate for this kind of thing. The government doesn't have the knowledge or experience or anything to be able to tell people exactly what recipes they should be using. Of course it has to be voluntary. The whole SALT program, which these guys use as the great precedent, that was entirely voluntary. You couldn't possibly have it mandatory anyway. It's bad enough that it's voluntary. So yeah, they're being very outraged about it. In actual fact, it's people like us who should be outraged about it because we're having to pay more for no reason for our soft drinks and our food's going to taste worse.
And Rob, what's your reaction to all this?
Some products, they will just try and take sugar out of it, 20% sugar out of it. Some of it, they're just going to make the portions smaller, so that chocolate bar is going to shrink. And so we're just going to get lower value for money for our hard-earned cash. It's ludicrous. We have choices already. It's quite clearly labelled on our food products what's contained within them, and we can make choices about them, particularly around fizzy drinks. I mean, we know that the sugary version of a fizzy drink is right next to the zero sugar version of the fizzy drink on the shelf or in the refrigerator. Interesting point Chris makes about legislation, because I was struck by the fact that once again the British Retail Consortium, which represents the big supermarkets, has demanded legislation and demanded that this should not be a voluntary reduction in sugar, which you might think at first sight is bizarre, but they're so little trust each other, the big supermarkets, so they've all agreed that actually they need to be bound by law about this. As Chris says, I mean, it's just a nonsense, the idea that Whitehall has any expertise in terms of trying to tell us the exact recipes of things. I mean, the fact that they're just carte blanche reducing everything by 20% is bizarre, because some products you probably would never miss the sugar in it, and other ones, it's fundamental to the very nature of the product, whether it's a chocolate bar or a cake or a biscuit. Taking 20% sugar out of it is going to make it taste distinctly inferior.
And Chris, picking up on Rob's point there about the reaction of the industry to all this, because one of the main arguments against this strategy, the criticisms, is that it basically shows that the government is somehow in hock to big business and to big food, and that they've kind of fallen over in the face of corporate lobby. Given what Rob said, is that really all it seems?
Well, no, because obviously industries have different motives and different objectives, and industry is very often lobbying government for its own self-interested reasons, of course. And there's nothing more disgusting than seeing industry, as Sainsbury's did the other day, lobbying the government to penalise consumers. I can only assume that Sainsbury's think that by bringing in all this legislation, they will squeeze out their smaller competitors, i.e. small shops. It's not going to squeeze out Tesco's. It's classic corporate behaviour to get the government to help out the big corporations by giving them all this regulation, which whatever they might say, they love because it squeezes out the smaller players. It's absolutely disgusting, and it's incredibly hypocritical for the Action on Sugar people and all these other groups to be basically on these guys' side. And I saw it when the strategy came out. The first day when the strategy came out, in what, let's face it, there was a U-turn there. The thing was 13 pages long. Clearly it had some stuff cut out. So, great as far as I'm concerned. But because of that, they say, oh, this is industry lobbying, this industry's got its way, blah, blah, blah. The very next day, when this guy from Sainsbury's says we want regulation to make us degrade the quality of our products, essentially, Action on Sugar was saying, why won't government listen to the retailers? The government's ignoring industry. It's just terrible. You can't make it up.
And so, Rob, shifting from the companies to the consumer here, one of the interesting things, this is being framed very much as a kind of inequality issue. So many of Theresa May's critics are saying that given that obesity affects the poor disproportionately, this move kind of cuts against that pledge she made in her first speech as Prime Minister, saying that she would devote this government to social justice. So what do you make of this argument that Theresa May is kind of letting down the poor by climbing down on some of these things?
Well, I mean, it is a nonsense because what the effect of this policy will be is to make food more expensive or to reduce portion sizes, which will be water off a duck's back to the middle classes who can easily afford these things. But when every penny counts, when you're at the right at the bottom end of the sort of pay scale, then this is going to make poorer people worse off, and poorer people enjoy these products as it happens more because they can't go to their local sort of artisan chocolatier to get something. They're going to be buying Mars bars and stuff off the shelf in Tesco. So of course it's going to hit those people more. I mean, it does concern me the way that argument is being framed because Theresa May doesn't seem to be, at least on these issues, as interventionist as perhaps some other people, but she has set a stall out around inequality, and it's clearly that's why they are pushing that argument now, because they want to call her out as a hypocrite. 6 months, 12 months down the line, once the sort of honeymoon period is over, will Theresa May start to sort of backslide on that kind of thing and justify a change of heart in terms of inequality? That does worry me.
Your question, Tom, is premised on the idea that any of this stuff is actually going to work. Any of this stuff that's being put forward is actually going to reduce obesity amongst anyone of whatever income level. And it's not. The stuff that these guys are coming out with is just stupid. They don't understand the issue. They don't understand the problem. They just hate industry, and they're just trying to import a whole load of stupid ideas they brought in from the tobacco wars to this. There's no reason whatsoever to think that the sugar levy is going to have any effect on obesity. Sugary drink consumption has fallen an amazing amount. I was surprised to see when I looked into this recently. 45% decline since 2003 in sugary drink consumption. And there's been a massive natural shift in the market voluntarily from people shifting from sugary drinks to water and diet drinks. It's had bugger all effect on obesity. And why would it? Would sugary drinks only make up 3% of the calories? The advertising ban, which would actually not just ban Pizza Hut and McDonald's, as these people seem to assume. It would ban such a wide variety of food you cannot imagine. It would ban orange juice. It would ban cheese. It would ban, obviously, all confectionery, all of Nigella's Christmas adverts. And, it's a terrible, terrible idea. But it would have no effect, in all probability, on obesity. The obesity rise, such as it's been amongst children, and it's actually fallen in the last 10 years, it only affects 1 in 10 children. I'm not saying that's, nothing, but it's still obviously a fairly small minority. So the idea that obesity is caused by our environment and its low prices and supermarkets is causing this. Why is it only causing it in 1 in 10 people, right? This is a classic example where public health people should be looking at the fairly small minority of people who are affected and leaving everybody else alone.
Just to expand on that, what is the government doing having an obesity strategy in the first place? Obesity is an individual problem. For the government, for Whitehall to sort of have a strategy about that seems to be absolutely bizarre. Perfectly fine to have a strategy about dealing with diseases that come out of that, because that's part of health, which is a public service at the moment. But for the government to be deciding how much kids exercise, or the price of foods, or whether supermarkets are allowed to have discounts on certain kinds of foods, it to me just seems to be absolutely bizarre.
I mean, and picking up on Chris's point about the extent of the problem, because I know this is something you've written a lot about, Rob. I mean, the extent to which we have an obesity crisis is just kind of taken as given, but is that really all it seems?
Well, the rates of obesity have been pretty static for quite a while now. I mean, as Chris mentioned, childhood obesity would seem to have fallen since about 2004, 2005. Certainly hasn't gone up. Adult obesity has maybe gone up by 1 or 2 percentage points. But the idea that there's this obesity time bomb about to go off as we all turn into bloaters is just complete nonsense. And in any event, most of the people who are fall into the category of obese are mildly chubby. It has no health consequences for them whatsoever. They may not be quite as sexually attractive, but it's actually a very small minority of the population that actually faces significantly increased health risks from obesity, and they should target help at those people. There are people who are to some extent semi-disabled by just how fat they are, and they obviously need some serious help to deal with that rather than lectures or sugary drinks taxes. And on the other hand, the vast majority of us should be left well alone to make our own choices for ourselves.
Yeah, when it comes down to the really enormous people that you invariably see when they make these documentaries about, the man who can't stop eating and he has to be winched out of his bedroom and all this kind of stuff. And the morbidly obese people, we're talking about 1% of the population. And they probably have got some kind of problem that needs addressing, either, psychologically or whatever. But clearly that is a tiny, tiny percentage. For the rest of the population, this issue simply does not really matter. Maybe you might sacrifice 2 or 3 years of life, perhaps, as a recent study suggested. Most people, I think, would say that is a perfectly reasonable trade-off to make if you're not prepared to, live on Vita for the rest of your life. It's just not an issue. And when I'm on the radio talking about this, invariably, after I've kind of, critiqued whatever nonsense has been proposed, I got asked the question, well, what would you do about it, Mr. Snowden? What's your solution? I said, well, I haven't got a solution. If I was in government, this would not even be in my top 1,000 things to look at. There are so many serious issues around the world and in this country to address. Why on earth is a government embarking on this kind of quixotic campaign to reduce our waistline? Something that it can't do, in all probability, and it shouldn't be doing anyway, because it's none of their business and it doesn't really matter.
So I guess that's a good point to move on to our second topic. So let's talk a little bit about Theresa May and look a little bit closer at what her government means for public health, for lifestyle freedom. Now, the Tories under Cameron seem pretty content to continue New Labour's legacy with regards to a lot of nanny state intervention, indeed in many ways taking it up a notch. But Chris, I know you wrote a piece in the wake of May's coronation saying that she was actually surprisingly sound on these issues. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the Morning Advertiser, which is a pub trade journal, asked me the day she got elected if I'd write something about what Theresa May means for the future of pubs, and I had no idea. She's never said anything about pubs as far as I can tell. And I wrote an article which, as soon as I submitted, I realised was probably going to be like an albatross over my head, saying that she was surprisingly sound on lifestyle issues. This was based on the fact that she'd never really said anything about them, and that from what I could see of her voting record, when it came to smoking stuff, like banning smoking in cars, she'd voted either against or she'd abstained. So she didn't seem like a full dyed-in-the-wool public health nutter, at least. And ever since then, I've been waiting for her to make me look ridiculous. And so far, she hasn't, in fairness. The obesity strategy, I'm quite prepared to believe she took out some of the more mental stuff, I think. And with the alcohol guidelines, there's talk that she's going to, or her government is going to, not really water them down, but at least take the edges of them. So far, so good. Very early days. But I suspect she's got much bigger fish to fry with Brexit. And perhaps, although she's obviously not a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination, perhaps she has a basic sort of traditional conservative attitude of, we haven't done this before, so we're not going to start doing it now. Maybe we'll stop trying to be the world leader in all these ludicrous policies.
And so, Rob, what's your take? Do you think, at least from a kind of lifestyle freedoms perspective, there's reasons to be cheerful about a May government?
Well, I mean, as Chris said, Brexit's likely to keep her extremely busy anyway. It'd be the major issue of her premiership. She is a Conservative with a small c, as far as I can tell, and she seems to be much more motivated both by the sort of issues that she was involved with as Home Secretary and this question of social equality. We can say about Theresa May is that she doesn't have Cameron and Osborne's taste, at least as yet, for the symbolic gesture. I mean, the sugary drinks tax was Osborne's rabbit from the hat for his last budget. All the talk around Westminster was that the government was going to hold back on that and use it as a stick, as a threat to push through this voluntary reformulation of foods. So if industry doesn't play ball this time, then we're going to introduce some kind of sugar tax. And that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And then he decided to do it in much the same way as his ridiculous, things about bingo and pasties, in the past, because Osborne is very much a kind of PR, grab the headlines kind of politician. I suspect Theresa May probably is a bit more bread and butter about things and doesn't go along with such fripperies. But, as I said, give her a year or two in government, and if things start to get sticky, they might want some things that they can call good news around these issues.
And so, Chris, on the subject of Cameron then, looking back at all of those interventions he made, do you think that was a bit of a high watermark? And was it the case that, as Rob said, that did they really believe it, or is it, as Rob says, that it was just something which was a way of being seen to be doing something, being seen to be doing good?
I think Cameron really believed it. I don't think George Osborne did, probably. But I think Cameron did. I mean, Cameron really was, looking back, he was awful on this. He was worse than Blair and he was worse than Brown. If you look at what he actually did, before they were in power, the Labour government brought up this tobacco display ban, and the Tories and Lib Dems were both against it, and as soon as they got in power, they brought it in. Labour was against plain packaging, and the Tories brought it in. Labour hadn't even considered the sugar tax, the Tories brought it in. Labour had rejected minimum pricing. Cameron wanted to bring it in. He was the guy who was keenest on it, and it was only people like Theresa May who talked him out of it, reputedly. Cameron was dreadful on it. He was a real paternalist, patrician, old-fashioned, worst of the Tory party kind of leader in that sense. Most people are probably going to be better than him. And also, there's not a lot to do now. He's done so much of it. He's done so much of the agenda, him and Blair between them. May, I think, is bound to be better, I would think, just because of that. But Rob's right. It's very easy to get easy headlines with this. I'm just hoping that Theresa May is the kind of politician who's just going to say, look, this is not a priority for my government. We've got lots of things to do. And just ignores them. There's a legion of these people knocking around. They'll be swarming around all the new people now who are in the Department of Health, lobbying away. And you just have to stand up to them. They're just bullies, and you just have to stand up to them. They're like a whining child, and the only way to deal with it is just to put them in their place. Because at some point, a Prime Minister's going to have to realise that the loud, endless whining that you've been hearing since the obesity strategy was supposedly watered down is no different in scale or volume to the whining that you get if you do what they say. It just means if you do what they say, you get a 2-week break from it, right? It comes back. It's just an incessant white noise. And the only thing you can do is just stand up to them, and they've got no power. It's like the social justice warriors. If you stand up to their nonsense and all their anti-free speech stuff, they can't do anything about it. So I'm hoping Theresa May just give them the cold shoulder, and eventually, like a whining child, they'll realise they're not going to get in their way and shut up.
I mean, Rob, just building on what Chris has just said, if in some ways it feels like the best thing we can say about Theresa May, at least at this point, is that she might not take this any further, but that does gesture towards the point that at the very least this kind of level of intervention, this expectation that the government will take action on junk food or smoking or booze or whatever, has just kind of become the centre of our politics almost. It's just something that's quite accepted, something that will get crossbench support. What do you think that says, that we've gotten to a point where it's just assumed that the government should take that kind of a role?
Well, I think it's pretty terrible. We do not need the government in our lives on this basis at all. That we do live in a market society, and we do have, therefore, a huge range of choices about how we live, what foods and drinks that we consume, and so on. I also think that maybe if Theresa May is going to be interventionist, her interests are going to be directed towards other things. So I have a horrible feeling she's probably quite interested in all this early years stuff and this idea of neuro-parenting. I know that Andrea Leadsom was particularly keen on it, but it is the kind of thing where they think, well, we've kind of done the public health stuff now, and now what we need to do is intervene in parents. As Chris said, I mean, there really isn't much further they can go on public health anyway. I mean, there's so few places you're allowed to smoke, for example, and by extension, unfortunately, allowed to use an e-cigarette, because smoking bans just get replicated for e-cigarettes. Alcohol, they could do some ludicrous, slap on, graphic health warnings or something, but it doesn't seem like they're that keen on that, but they've done enough to restrict that as it is. And again, with the food stuff, I mean, A 20% tax on sugary drinks would have been absolutely unthinkable even 5 years ago. So the fact that that's gone through, I think they'll probably think, we're kind of done here. Let's move on to intervening in people's lives in some other horrible way.
And finally, let's talk about alcohol guidelines. One of the other things which has sent public health into a bit of a mania in reaction to Theresa May is the fact that there has been news that the alcohol guidelines are going to be refashioned, maybe even softened a little bit. Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, the new alcohol guidelines came out in January, and what the public health people are after is emulating cigarette warnings effectively. And to do that, they need to establish in the public's mind that alcohol causes cancer and that there's no safe level of drinking. And that's pretty much what the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, did. And it's more or less what the guidelines themselves were pushing towards. So the guidelines have been dropped for men, which means that for both men and women, it's 14 units a week, which is very little. And Sally Davis kind of gold-plated that by saying there is no safe level of drinking. And whenever I pick up a glass of red wine, I think about breast cancer, and so should everybody else. What the government apparently are going to be doing, and this fits into what we're saying about Theresa May possibly being a bit saner than some of the predecessors on this, they're not going to be saying there's no safe level of alcohol. They're going to say that you can have moderate drinking as part of a healthy lifestyle, and they're going to portray the cancer risks, such as they are, in the context of other lifestyle risks. Because, yes, it's true alcohol is associated with a few cancers. Most of them are very rare, and the increase in cancer risk, particularly if you're a non-smoker, is pretty small. So if you actually tell people that your lifetime risk of, throat cancer, for example, is, I'm making these figures up, but 1 in 50,000, and drinking makes that 1 in 45,000 or something, chances are most people go, okay, fair dues. And this is actually what David Spiegelhalter, who's a guy who actually does think about these things properly, he suggested that that's how you portray these risks. You put them in the context of other lifestyle decisions like crossing the road or driving a car or going for a swim or getting on an aeroplane. And once you do that, I think most people will realise that, okay, there's a slight increase in cancer risk, but it's nothing to really worry about compared to anything else in life.
Rob, what was your reaction to this story, especially just the subject of alcohol guidelines full stop? I know this is something you've written about before. To what extent are they even really useful, considering a lot of this must vary person to person?
Well, I mean, they're not particularly useful. I mean, Chris has written a lot of stuff pointing out that moderate drinking is actually good for you, or at least that people who are moderate drinkers live longer than teetotalers. Yeah, I mean, in and of themselves, the guidelines aren't useless as a tool, because the only people who are going to pay any attention to them are people like Sally Davis, who is going to go to some nice soiree, pick up a glass of wine, and start worrying about cancer. They are the serial worriers. They're the worried well who are going to are clogging up our GP surgeries up and down the country. And the rest of us go out and drink as much as is appropriate to the occasion, and then take a day or two off during the week to kind of recover from that. But what the guidelines do then suggest is that they'll say in a year's time or 2 years' time, oh, people aren't sticking to the guidelines, so therefore we need to have some kind of legislative action. And that's what worries me. They will produce some stupid policy, whether it is greater health warnings on alcohol, more taxes, minimum pricing, whatever. Some almost certainly useless policy that will only bump up the cost of alcohol, particularly for poorer people. That's the kind of thing that worries me, is that it becomes an excuse. You've kind of set an anchor in the political class's mind about what we should be aiming for, and then you can legislate around that. The reality is that you can drink far more than 14 units a week, probably 2-3 times that quite safely on a regular basis without any concerns about your health, other than that you might develop a bit of a gut if you're drinking those units in the form of beer. But otherwise, they're just not worth worrying about, and most people recognise that and drink because they're enjoying the company of the people around them rather than because they're worrying about a particular figure to aim at.
And so, Chris, picking up on that, we could talk about these guidelines being a little bit more sensible. We could also talk about Theresa May looking not to be as nannying as predecessors. But what's the outlook, do you think, for booze at this point? Do you share Rob's concern that it's looking like it's just going to set more and more of a precedent for restricting it in various other ways?
Yeah, Rob makes a very good point that it sets a very low anchor, because alcohol consumption has fallen so much in the last 15 years, and particularly amongst young people. So in order to keep up this panic, you've got to keep lowering the benchmark of what's harmful. The alcohol guidelines have gone down from 56 units to 36 units to 28 units to 21 units to 14 units. And it will end up being zero. I'm quite convinced about it because the model is tobacco. Very obviously, the model is to copy tobacco. That's why it's all about at the moment banning so-called junk food advertising on TV. That was the first start with the tobacco wars in the 60s. They want to ban alcohol advertising completely on TV and indeed everywhere else. Again, emulating the tobacco model. They want to put warning labels saying this causes cancer on it. These people haven't got any imagination. They just want to keep repeating and refighting the old war. They're not even the appropriate tools with these completely different issues. And as far as alcohol's a health problem, it's a health problem for a fairly small minority of alcoholics who are alcoholics for very complex, usually psychological reasons. And the same is probably true of most people who are morbidly obese. Nothing to do with bloody advertising or even price. But they just think, we'll just lay all this stuff that we laid on the smokers and it'll make a difference and we'll talk about the industry and blah, blah, blah. It's just so juvenile and pathetic.
And so Rob touched earlier on this thing of the kind of hypocrisy of the clampdown on booze. So much of it seems to be about stopping the poor from drinking rather than the rich. And one story that came up this month, which really seemed to sum up that hypocrisy quite beautifully, was the news that MPs being moved out of Parliament during its renovation are being moved into the Department of Health. And it turns out the Richmond House is held under an Islamic bond scheme and therefore forbids the sale of alcohol, and that's of course caused a lot of uproar in relation to that. And building on that, it also unearthed a scheme wherein it turned out MPs were actually trying to buy the Red Lion pub, which is a very popular Westminster boozer, so that they could again use that to serve subsidised alcohol and keep the public out. So Chris, what did you think of that story? Didn't that just sum it up?
It's just staggering. I mean, the fact that the Department of Health is essentially under Sharia law is pretty funny to begin with. I'm sure a lot of people in the Department of Health are quite happy about the booze restrictions. And it would be wonderful if the politicians get a taste of their own medicine and have to abide by it, or at least just have to go to a pub like normal people. That's fine. Get down the red line and spend your money. But rub shoulders with your constituents and the general public. But of course they can't bear the idea of doing that, so they actually want to use taxpayers' money to buy nice little pub in the centre of London. Probably build some kind of tunnel, I imagine, so they can slip under, go in there, and then have their booze subsidised by the taxpayers as well. Also, they can drink subsidised alcohol without having to meet the hoi polloi. It just beggars belief. And this wasn't some silly season story. This went to select committee. I mean, the only reason it didn't happen is because the people who own the Red Line told them to sod off. It's unbelievable. The guy who owns the Red Line, I think, was quoted as saying that politicians are pretty bad customers, and he thinks they'd be even worse landlords, which is probably right. But yeah, the fact that booze is subsidised at all in Parliament is pretty disgraceful.
Yeah, well, it's always all the people that the problem's with. It's not the middle classes drinking their Chateau Neuf de Pape that you have to worry about. It's the people drinking Tennant Super that you have to worry about, or them over there. And the Red Lion story just sort of kind of compounds it. I mean, the political class has got a problem, which is it is cut off from its constituency anyway. The idea that they are not prepared to just go into a bar and buy a pint with everybody else. The possibility that they might overhear a conversation that tells them something about the real world is just far too much for them. And presumably the smoking ban wouldn't apply if the Red Line was bought by and nationalised either. So it's one rule for us and another rule for them. And the reality is, with all of this public health stuff, is that because it's so ubiquitous, it seeps into almost everybody's brain. I can't believe that there is anybody who hasn't, to some extent, worried about what they eat or what they drink. Or for most of us, that is a fleeting moment. To sort of paraphrase Mark Twain, it's like every time I feel the need to exercise, I lie down until the mood passes. That's probably our attitude to most public health things in general, is that we think we should cut down on our boozing until we're having a cracking night with our friends, and then we have one over the 8. And that's a much healthier attitude, I think, to life than fretting about the number of calories we eat or the number of units we drink.
You've been listening to Last Orders. To subscribe to this podcast, as well as Spiked's weekly podcast show, head over to spiked-online.com. And if you'd like to help Spiked continue to thrive, be sure to make a donation. Thanks for listening.